Oh, I make that face every time. It's always, I start the first thing in the recording is we go as the woman starts shouting. Okay, and then I shall share my screen, which worked a moment ago when we tried it out. So hopefully it will work now, and you will be able to see my notes. Yeah, I know. Now you should be able to just see the slide. Is that right? You can't see my scribbly notes.
That's right.
Brilliant. Okay.
Do you want to share multitask today?
Oh, you can go for it.
So today we have Kate Scott, the founder of this Relevance Researchers Network, or co-founder, I must say, and very good colleague and an excellent relevance theory researcher, Kate Scott. And you will be talking to us about your kind of new idea, developing sort of ideas to apply relevance theory to some new field. I was really excited about this. So today we have Kate Scott talking about relevance and communication design. So floor is yours.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking for probably about 30 or 35 minutes. So hopefully there'll be some time for a discussion afterwards. And as Ryoko said, this is very tentative idea and work that I'm presenting. It's the first time I've presented some of these ideas and some thoughts that I've been having around what relevance theory might be able to say to people who are working and practicing in visual communication and messaging design. So a bit of background. Why did I start thinking about this? Well, in February this year, I moved to a new role within my institution. So previously, I was a lecturer and head of department in our humanities department, teaching English language and a bit of creative writing. And now I've moved and I've taken up a new role as director of research in our design school, which is a bit of a shift in focus, really. I'm not a designer, but in this new role looking after research, I've been talking to many of my new colleagues, and I found some really interesting synergies and shared interests with the work that they're doing and the ideas that we play with in pragmatics and in relevance theory particularly. The design school that I'm in now covers fashion, interior design, product design, but maybe most relevant for me, animation, illustration, and graphic design. And as part of my new role, I'm going to be teaching workshops to MA students who are studying visual communication with a focus on either graphic design or animation and illustration. So this prompted me to think about whether design is an area worth exploring more from a relevance theory perspective, particularly giving that kind of cognitive perspective on how communication functions that relevance theory offers. And how we can kind of understand how we're interpreting messages that are communicated to us. So I've also been thinking about the kind of practical applications that might come from this. It might be a practical application of relevance theory. So these are the kind of questions I've been asking myself. First of all, is this area worth exploring more? And it might be that at the end of this session, I kind of think, well, actually everything I've said is fairly obvious and maybe there's not much else to say and this isn't very fruitful. But I'm hoping there might be some areas where it's like, actually, these two fields could speak to each other. What practical applications might there be? What can designers working in visual communication learn from relevance theory? And conversely, what can pragmatics, those people working in pragmatics, learn from practitioners who are working in visual communication and designing messaging strategies day in, day out? Lots of my colleagues are practitioners as much, if not more, than being researchers. So my ideas are very rudimentary at the moment, and I've been really interested to hear everyone's ideas, thoughts, and objections. And I was just saying to Ryoko, every time I've run this presentation over the last few days, I've thought of something else that I should have said or could have said, or another area, oh, but what about this? So there might be quite a few, but what about that moments in this? But, that's okay, I think. I'm going to present some tentative thoughts about how we might explain the relative success of different visual communication strategies. And I'm going to do that by focusing on one particular area, just really as an example to get the conversation going and to get thinking about design and relevance. And the area that I've decided to look at, partly because there's quite a lot of studies in the area, is nutritional labeling on pre-packaged food. I know, exciting stuff. So I've chosen this as a starting point because there are various systems for communicating nutritional information on food packaging. They vary around the world, they vary within areas as well. They follow different visual design systems, and they can very easily be compared for that reason. And there have been various studies conducted into the effectiveness of these various systems, both in terms of how successfully they convey information, so how do they get their message across, but also, do they have an effect on altering behaviour? Do they affect the choices that people make when they're choosing the foods, the products that they're going to buy? So I want to explore a few of these and see if ideas from relevance theory can be used to explain the results. Talking to some of my design colleagues, it seems that designers will often have a kind of hunch about what they think will work, and they'll create a prototype for a design, and it might go through a little bit of testing, but then it goes out into the world, and there's kind of a trial and error element to this design process. And what I want to do is see whether relevance theory can feed into the early stages of the design processes, where you're thinking about the needs of the customer, and help us to think about those needs of the consumer, customer, buyer from a kind of cognitive perspective, and maybe producing some kind of flowchart or algorithm or toolkit that designers could use to assess the ways in which customers are likely to engage with labeling. And of course, if we can show that this works for food labeling, then there might be lots of other applications as well. And I'm thinking about particularly things like health messaging, and why it might reach some demographics and not others, why some people might respond to, for example, the call to have a COVID-19 vaccination and other groups might not, and how messaging might be adapted and designed differently for perhaps different groups based on the assumptions that they bring to their interpretation. Okay, so that's something that I'll come back to a little bit at the end as well. So a bit of background. Food labeling is regulated by governments around the world, and they legislate on what you can put and what you can't put onto labeling. Here are some examples just as background from the UK. They vary throughout the world, but I thought I'd just give you some examples. So in the UK, we get the kind of labels on the back of usually of food products that you'll see on the right there. All pre-packaged food must include a nutritional declaration. It has to be clearly presented in a specific format, and it has to give values for energy and for certain nutrients. And the values have to be given in particular units, and the nutritional declaration must meet the certain minimum font size requirements. So you can't hide it in a tiny little corner of the product, it has to be visible. So this is kind of what's legislated for, and there isn't that much wiggle room for designers as to how they convey this information. But what I'm more interested in today is what's known as front of pack labeling. And front of pack labeling is currently voluntary in the UK. So you don't have to have this on food products, but it's probably the labeling that you see most obviously when you're looking at products on the shelf. So it's this kind of label that you'll see on the right of the screen here. It is voluntary in the UK, but the government encourages food manufacturers to use this. And there are standards around what can and can't be included. So although it's voluntary, you can't just put anything in there. It has to follow certain guidelines. So, for example, you have to provide a meaningful portion size. So if for example, it's a pack of 6 burgers, a portion size would be a burger. So you've got to provide the information in a way that is easily processed, I think, that makes sense, that's meaningful. You have to provide what's now called RI information, reference intake information. For those of you who are familiar with UK food packaging, this was formerly called GDA, or Guideline Daily Allowance. It's the same thing, it's just now called RI. And in the United States, you sometimes see DV used here instead, which is percent daily value. And this is basically what percentage of your allowance for that day does this food product represent. Colour coding is often a part of this system, or a front of pack labelling, although it doesn't have to be, as we shall see. And the government says that the label design must not mislead or confuse the customer. Okay, so that's kind of the background of where we are at the moment, and it's this front of pack labelling that I'm interested in. And really my initial aims are to think about whether we can use ideas from relevance theory to explain customer engagement with different sorts of front of pack nutritional labelling on food products. Can relevance theory then be used to help designers and perhaps policymakers produce more effective visual communication in this area? Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is introduce a couple of the systems and some of the studies that have been done to compare them. So the first 2 systems are known as the traffic light system, and really a bunch of closely related systems called the facts up front labelling system. So the traffic light system is probably familiar to many of you. This is where the different nutrients are colour coded: red, green or amber, orange colour. Red meaning don't eat too much, or think about whether you should eat this. Green meaning this is fine, eat as much as you like. And orange or amber meaning kind of okay, don't eat too much, but you can have a bit here. So these systems often also include this statistical information, the percentage of your daily intake, the grams of each nutrient in the portion, but really the most salient feature of them is this traffic light system, the colour coding, that you can at a glance work out relatively how healthy the product is. And it's often called a multiple traffic light system because you get one for each of the nutrients rather than for the product overall. And then we can compare that with what I'm calling it's what's known in the US as the facts up front system. And you can see this is very similar in many ways, but there's no colour coding, and there tends to be a little bit more detailed information about the milligrams or percentage or facts or nutrients. So there's more information, but less colour coding. And this is used, you can see it says 20% DV, that's percent daily value. In the UK, that would be called RI, reference intake, and that might vary over different territories, but it's very common to represent this percentage of what you should have per day. Okay, so there's a study by Roberto et al. In 2012, which compares these 2 systems. And they found that, what they did was they compared them by asking participants to complete a quiz on the nutritional value of various food items. So they were shown, for example, 2 products that were very similar. So they might have been shown Snyder's of Hanover pretzels, honey mustard and onion, that you can see on the right hand side, the packaging for that. And you can see it's quite small, but you can just see a little facts up front style label on there. And that would be compared with another product very similar, for example, Roll Gold honey mustard pretzel pieces, which I couldn't find a picture of, but included labeling. They found that the participants who were provided with traffic light information performed best in the quiz. So they could most easily identify which, for example, had the lower saturated fat. So And also participants were asked to score how easily they found interpreting the information and an ease of understanding. And again, the traffic light labeling system also scored highest on this survey as well. And this is one study, but there are lots of similar studies, and this result is replicated again and again. The traffic light system performs better than the facts up front system in terms of communicating information. So it immediately tells us that cramming lots of information onto a label isn't necessarily the best way to help consumers assess the healthfulness of a product. And immediately, I think we can start to think about this in terms of processing effort that might be involved in accessing and doing something with the information that's on each of these labels. And we'll look at how that plays out in a moment in more detail when I kind of apply a pragmatic relevance theory interpretation process to the different labels. Okay, and then a third category of labeling that we find, and that quite a lot of research has been done on, is having a warning. So rather than providing nutritional value information, instead taking the route of warning against high levels of unhealthy components, nutrients within the product. And this is used in Chile. So there's an example. I think this is the Chilean version of Frosties or Frosty Flakes if you're in the US. And if you can see the two little black shapes with signs in them, with white writing in them, this is what they are. They are warning signs, so they're telling you that it's high in sugar, high in calories, or alternatively high in saturated fats, high in sodium or salt. So this doesn't tell us anything about what's good in the product, only tells us about, it only warns us about the bad things that are going on in this particular product. And quite a few studies have been done comparing this approach of warning with the other two systems that we just looked at. So a study in 2017 by Rua et al. They found that warnings improved consumers' ability to identify unhealthy products better compared with both the facts up front and the traffic light system labels. So if your intention is to stop people eating something, to identify what's unhealthy, then the warning seems to work really, really well. But when it was about identifying the most healthy product, the warnings and the traffic light systems worked about the same. So there's kind of asymmetry there. If you want people to identify unhealthy, then put warnings on. But if you want them to identify healthy products to choose, then there's not much between the warnings and the traffic light. Similar results in another study by a team led by the same lead researcher in the same year, but this time looking at children. So a study on children and their choice of snacks, and it provided preliminary evidence of the influence of labeling on children's choice of snacks. So having some labeling versus no labeling definitely made an impact on the snacks that children chose, and warning signs in this study seem to have more influence than traffic light systems. So as a summary, what we've got is traffic light systems appear to be more effective than facts up front systems. Warnings seem to be the most successful of all, particularly when the aim is to identify unhealthy products. Okay, so where does relevance theory come into all of this? Well, I'm hoping that it provides us with a way to understand that pattern that we've just seen and how information is processed. And crucially, it allows us to bring that role of processing effort into our understanding of how consumers are interacting with the product labeling. So just a couple of points really to sort of highlight from relevance theory to get us thinking in terms of the product's labeling. So as we know, interpreting information in context involves accessing contextual assumptions that can combine with the information in some way to yield cognitive effects. So that's the point I'm going to come back to in a moment. to try to explain the difference between the traffic light and the facts up front system, that in terms of the information has to be able to combine with something in order to be relevant, to yield cognitive effects. And we'll think about how that might work out in a moment. And of course, the relevance of the information is affected by how easy the new information is to access, the processing effort involved, and by how easy it is to access contextual assumptions with which that information can combine. So again, really thinking about, it's not just about giving information to the consumers, it's about giving it to them in a way that they can do something with it. They can do something cognitive with it. Okay, so to work through a kind of interpretation process, I've simplified matters a little bit, and I'm aware every time I think about this that this is a simplification that I'm going through here. But what I want to do is think about the processing that would be involved in looking at each of these labels, interpreting each of these labels for our ideal health conscious consumer or customer. So a customer who walks into the shop, picks up the product and holds these assumptions. I want to purchase healthy products. I do not want to purchase unhealthy products. Now, just as a little interesting aside, when I Googled health conscious customer, the Google images that I found to decorate my slide communicated to me that ideal health conscious customers are women, young women who like to smile at pieces of fruit. So that's what we've got on the slide there. Obviously nobody else would ever hold these assumptions, but Google Images is obviously got an idea there. So not everybody will hold these assumptions, of course. Perhaps nutritional labeling isn't going to have an effect on people who don't care about the nutritional value of their food. So we assume that it's trying to reach people who have at least some kind of assumption relating to health. And of course, we might not always hold these assumptions every time we make a purchasing decision. I'll come back to that right at the end. So sometimes we want to purchase healthy products. Sometimes we know full well we're buying something that isn't healthy, and we're okay with that. I'll come back to that at the end. But just to kind of simplify matters to allow us to compare these three systems. So first of all, the traffic light system. If we think about the input that we have here, and I'm particularly focusing here on the idea that you've picked up a product probably with an interest in purchasing it. So in a way, you're kind of holding the assumption that you're going to buy it, and maybe it's about whether that assumption gets cancelled or not. You're going to see that red label. You're going to see that red saturates label as part of the traffic light system. So the input is red label, and that needs to combine with a contextual assumption to tell us something. What does this mean? And I think there's a fairly accessible contextual assumption that says, well, red means unhealthy, it means stop, it means danger. It's called a traffic light system, and we know that red in the traffic light system means stop. Now, obviously, this is coded information. It's culturally specific, we assume. It has to be learned. But I think it's a fairly accessible assumption that most people looking at this product would probably have access to. So that leads us to the conclusion that the product is unhealthy. We already have our assumption, remember, from our ideal customer who do not want to purchase unhealthy products. And that leads us very easily and quickly to the conclusion, I do not want to purchase the product. So we don't have to access very many assumptions, only one really, that we didn't already have, and it's highly accessible to us already. So we can make that decision very quickly. As I said earlier, there's often other information on the labels, information about the grams and the percentages, but we don't need to access those because we get the information from the color coding immediately. We can make that decision and we can reach that, perhaps it's not as healthy as I thought, I don't want to purchase it decision. Now, if we compare that with the facts up front labeling system, so this is where we've got reference intake or GDA information on our label. So that's the example again there. What happens here? What's the input that we might get? Well, just looking at one part of that label, let's look at the sodium or salt component. The input that we've got here is something like this. One portion of this product contains 460 milligrams of sodium. Let's assume we know that that's salt, which is 20% of my daily recommended allowance. So my question then is, well, what contextual assumptions can this information combine with to help us make a decision? It doesn't seem to me that there's very many highly accessible assumptions kind of buzzing around easily for this to combine with. We might not know how much 460 milligrams of salt is. Is that a lot? Is it not a lot? Is 20% of my daily allowance? Is that good? Is that bad? It's very hard to kind of get a grip on what that means and what effects it might lead to. So the best I could come up with was something like this as a contextual assumption. If I have already eaten and or plan to eat over 80% of my daily recommended allowance of salt today, it would not be healthy for me to eat a whole portion of this product. Now that's very complicated, and still there's lots of questions there. You need to be thinking about what you've already eaten that day, what you plan to eat later on, what the nutritional value of those other products is, how much of this product do you plan to eat? Lots of questions, very hard to reach a conclusion based on this input. And I think it's highly likely that if you pick this up, quite fancying it, thinking you're going to buy it, you're probably going to abandon any attempts to derive any cognitive effects from this information, and you're just going to throw it in your basket, whether it's good or bad. I think an added complication with this system is you've got this information about recommended daily intake, but it doesn't really tell you whether this is something that you should be aiming to make. Should you be trying to get to 100% of this nutrient, or should you be trying to avoid, should that be the maximum or should it be the minimum that you're aiming for? So as somebody with a kind of reasonable amount of nutritional information, knowledge, I know that salt and sugar and fat are things that I should be trying not to have too much of. So I might see those as maximums. And I know that fiber is something that's good for me. So maybe I'm trying to get to 100% fiber. That would be a good thing. But for something like potassium that's on this label, I don't really know whether 20% of potassium is, oh dear, I've had 20%, I've got to be careful, or yay, I've had 20%, I'm well on way to my target. So it's very hard to kind of assess whether that's a good thing or a bad thing in the abstraction here, unless you've got those quite detailed nutritional value information as part of your general knowledge. So it's going to exclude a lot of people from being able to derive relevant conclusions. Then finally, warning systems. So the warning systems are interesting, I think, because you've got an input such as this, which says, let's say, high in salt. And not only have we got the information that it's high in salt, but it's presented as a warning. So those in Chile, those symbols always mean a warning on food. There's never any good information presented in this this shape with the black background and the white writing. So even if you don't know that salt is something you should be limiting, you can deduce that from the fact that there's a warning associated with it being too high. So our impact is high in salt, and this can quite easily combine with the assumption that foods that are high in salt are unhealthy. Now, even if you didn't hold that as an assumption before, you can deduce it from the presence of a warning. That leads you, then we've got our other assumption, I do not want to purchase unhealthy products from our ideal customer. And the conclusion that this leads us to is, again, I do not want to purchase this product. So warning systems are very good at getting us to the do not purchase decision. Again, very quickly, very easily, with highly accessible or inferable assumptions. They're not, however, so good at helping us make the buy decision. there's nothing in the warnings that can combine with the other assumption that we hold. I do want to buy healthy products. So they don't tell us anything in that respect. So some thoughts at this point. Labeling needs to guide a consumer to either a buy or don't buy conclusion in as few steps as possible and by relying on as few contextual assumptions as possible. More information on the label doesn't necessarily lead to more conclusions. The information on the label is only relevant if it can combine with contextual assumptions and easily accessible contextual assumptions. They have to be easily accessible, or a consumer is likely to abandon their search for relevance. Warning systems only guide customers to a don't buy conclusion, as they can only combine contextual assumptions about what a customer shouldn't buy or what's not good for them, particularly when we're in this ideal health-oriented customer scenario. Some further thoughts. There's another study by Araya et al. In 2019, and what they did was looked at the effects of warning labels on different categories of food. So what they found was that when warning labels were put on foods such as breakfast cereals, there was a substantial reduction in the probability that somebody would purchase the food. So we saw the Chilean Frosties earlier on with the warning signals signs on. So you pick up your breakfast cereal, you think it's relatively healthy, you see the warning sign and you realize it isn't. It's got high sugar, it's got high calories, and you put it back on the shelf. However, and perhaps not surprisingly, consumers tend not to substitute away from products that have warning labels if they are products like chocolates and cookies. So I've got the picture of cupcakes on the screen there. It's got 3 bright red traffic light things staring at you immediately when you pick up the product. But their study found that this kind of labeling didn't make a difference to people's choices when it came to this kind of food. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You already know that chocolate cake, cookies, chocolate is unhealthy. So the warning isn't relevant. The information that the product is unhealthy is not relevant because the customer already knows this. It's not changing our beliefs. We've picked it up with the knowledge that it's unhealthy. So one size doesn't necessarily fit all if we're going to try and change consumer behavior. And if we want people to stop buying chocolate cakes, assuming we do, then another strategy needs to be in place. So this labeling might work very well for things that seem healthy but maybe aren't. But if we know something is unhealthy, labeling makes no difference whatsoever. And I think that we can kind of see why if we take that relevance perspective. Okay, so some implications to think about. One size does not fit all when it comes to encouraging consumers to make healthier choices, assuming that that's what policymakers and some designers want to do. Policymakers and designers need to consider the context in which the information will be processed. And they also need to consider the processing effort involved in getting from the message to a desired conclusion. So it's backwards engineering that consumer journey that we go on. More information is not necessarily better in terms of communicating a simple message and maybe changing behavior. And then there's just another couple of small points that have kind of occurred to me as I've been thinking around these issues and thinking about what might be useful for my colleagues in design and the students that I'm going to be working with. Some other possible points for consideration. I think designers really need to analyze the context in which users will access their messaging from this cognitive perspective. I know they do this anyway, but I think they need to add in what assumptions do members of my audience hold? And I think they need, so compare, for example, messaging that would work for consumers who are actively looking for that messaging. So for example, if you're in a pub or a bar or a restaurant or a nightclub and you're looking for the bathrooms, then you're actively looking for messaging, and that's going to perhaps require a different strategy to be successful and to communicate the information than messaging where you're trying to attract a consumer's attention, like health warnings or the nutritional labelings that we just looked at. Is the audience looking for the information or not, or do we have to attract their attention, make it seem relevant to them, or are they already working off the assumption that it is relevant? So I'm thinking and playing with the idea that relevance theory as a framework can be used as a kind of a tool to help us understand the consumer journey, the audience journey, as they process messaging. And I think it allows us to compare different designs, different versions of the same message that can be put out there into the world. That's my very random thoughts on how relevance theory and design might work together. Those are the references to the studies that I've talked about today, and I'm going to finish there and hope some people have got some ideas for me. Stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Kate. Very interesting. Very interesting. And maybe people can just, if you have already questions, fire away. If not, oh, there's a hands up, and Billy, of course, you have your camera on, so I knew that. Billy?
Thanks. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, and definitely agree with all the ideas you've got about how we approach things. And I think we've all had the experience of misunderstanding a label, thinking something's healthy when it isn't. It makes me think to old-fashioned examples from years ago. People used to talk about packaging that said 80% fat-free on it, and people would point out it could have said 20% solid fat, and you would think differently. But I had an example the other day when a student came into class, and my class had been double booked. So the room it was usually in, another class was in, and I was in the room next door, and a helpful person put a sign up for me on the door, and it said, Billy Clark's class, room B1.663. And that was on the door of room B1.661. So the student just interpreted this as confirming that my class was in the room that the sign was on. And so it was a nice example for relevance theory, because then we discussed in class, what would the extra things you do be that would make somebody notice? So the students started talking about put big arrows on it, because if they just see that, their spontaneous comprehension heuristic will just think, oh yeah, it's confirming the room I'm in.
So it wasn't in that room. It wasn't in the room that the label was on. It was a few doors down.
Yeah,
right.
And what was also nice was that people were in the room talking. And so the student said, I was about to walk in, but then I heard speech. So then she inferred something else because she got some different evidence. I just realized I haven't got a question at all, but I suppose it's just saying that you've convinced me, and that I think there's loads of examples in everyday life that would apply. You know, you pick up your thing, you're expecting it to be healthy, you don't look closely at the numbers and so on.
Yeah, and examples are really useful for me, because I have to run a workshop with design students in a few weeks, and I need to give some more examples to think about. So I should be stealing the 80%, 20% one, and how that encourages us to see it in a particular way and draw certain conclusions from the messaging that we choose to give. I'll definitely be stealing that one. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question, so I'm not going to answer.
Hopefully somebody else has got a question.
Yeah.
We have Stephen with hands up.
Yeah, I was thinking about that last example of the unhealthy dessert. And often I find that would be helpful messaging if the person is assuming they want a tasty dessert, that it would actually discourage them buying from other healthy desserts, where I don't want to have a special vegan something, because sometimes the taste is different than what you'd expect. So that messaging could in fact help people make a decision to buy the unhealthy dessert over a more healthy option. During this whole presentation, one thing that was coming to me is often in design schools, they create mood boards. And the purpose behind those mood boards is to give a certain feeling, but taken from a relevance theory approach, how does relevance theory play into that construction of, okay, I'm going to design something, whether it be food packaging, whatever, but I want this feeling. Well, you're really playing on assumptions and encyclopedic entries of people and meaning and words and life experience. And so I think relevance theory really could have more impact in the design world as they work through that process, giving them terms and framework and structure. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And really the nutritional labeling thing was just a real tip of the iceberg, just to kind of give me something to hook onto. And I absolutely think there's all of that, a lot of more of that to be said. And just, as you say, a kind of a way to think about the decisions or the kind of ideas that they've got, and just kind of compare and deconstruct them a little bit to follow that cognitive journey. Because I think there's a lot of, I think they're probably making great decisions, but they don't necessarily know why something works or why something doesn't work. And so and I'm starting to kind of get familiar with the design process by seeing what's going on with my colleagues, and just feeding that into the kind of context assessment stage of that. So, what are my customers bringing? What assumptions are they bringing? And also, I think it's very, this is the case with all of us, isn't it? That it's very easy to just assume that everybody has the same assumptions as you do. And so therefore, you might design something that works for you and then be confused that this whole group aren't going with your messaging, or a misunderstanding. I'm sure we've all had that experience teaching. Why aren't they understanding what I'm saying? And maybe to deconstruct it in terms of, oh, well, that's because they've come to this with a different assumption. And I think I really like that the point about the red labels indicate that something might be really, full of fat, and that might be just what you want at certain times. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I say, this food. So I see a question in the chat. I always assume the overly detailed system was intended precisely to deluge the customer with information that would be meaningless to them. And I think that might be the case, but this front of package information is voluntary. All of that information is on the back. All of the really detailed information has to be there. It's on the back, but they don't have to have a label on the front at all. So there might be a bit of that. Or maybe it's the kind of look, we're giving you this information, we care about our customers, but they don't actually really want them to be able to do anything with the information. So it's like trying to get the best of both worlds. We care about you, but we don't actually want you to understand that this is unhealthy. Tom's nodding. Yeah, I think that could be it. But I mean, I think most industry standard in the UK at least seems to be traffic light system now, so they don't get away with that.
Yeah. Sorry to come in here, and the brandly nature of this labeling kind of interests me, because on the one hand they want to sell their products, so they don't really want to say it's not healthy, but at the same time it's not just a nutritious value that the food producer is selling. Sometimes, everyone knows like alcohol is not good for you. Everyone knows chocolate is not that great for you. But sometimes you want that this particular item, not for the nutritious value, but for the, as you said, Stephen, earlier, the mood or feeling of the product, of mood or feeling you get out of consuming certain products. So in a way, they are competing on the packaging. So on the one hand, they have all the fonts and drawings and or design of trying to sell this really nice cupcakes or whatever, while having this very industrial looking food labels. So in a way, what relevance theory could also contribute to is to let designers think how they could combine the different aspects of the food and to make what they want to communicate more salient, if you will. And
yeah, I mean, what I focus on today is the nutritional value, which, as people have said, the actual food producers might not be that keen on communicating that information. They have to, and they have to be seen to be doing that. But yeah, then there's the whole other aspects of the rest of the packaging and the design of that, how that might lure people in or make them feel a particular way, and what relevance theory might have to say about all those kind of design issues.
Competition and balance, yeah. But anyway, sorry, I just interrupted. I jumped in when Tom was waiting for a while. Sorry about that.
It's all fine. In many ways, your comments and the ones before are very much on the theme of the question I want to ask. So in some ways, it's already been touched on, but maybe I can crystallize it partly for myself as much as anything. Are you a little bit guilty of something relevance theory often gets criticized for, which is being too audience focused and not enough speaker focused? So the cynic in me says that the goal of the food producers is not to communicate health information. The goal is to sell the product. And sometimes that means complying with regulations, but doing so in a way that does blah, blah, hides the information potentially and so on. Or maybe even, I mean, I know you, in your response to just now, you said, that there's still the front of packet information that you can look at. But even, I mean, I'd be tempted to, like, different companies make different choices about the sizes of the traffic lights, the fonts they use, the size of the fonts. Part of that is to do with branding, it's to do with mood, it's to do with, all sorts of things to do with selling the product. And I wonder if consideration of those micro motives might help think about how the audiences are going about their decision-making process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think this is a tricky one, because there is that conflict of not really you don't want to put a big, you're not going to put a don't buy this, it's high in fat, unless, for example, in Chile, they have to have that on there. So I think, and this is as much about, I started off thinking about product designers for the food and end up thinking, actually, this is more a policy decision. This is more about what governments legislate on. And as I say, and then in the UK, I think that what's happened is that the big manufacturers have kind of decided to go with the guide, followed what's recommended, which does have things like they recommend you do color coding, and then they get a kind of a halo effect around that, don't they? And it's like you're following the guidelines, so therefore you're a good producer, even if you're not interested in the individual product. You're Sainsbury's and you put this on your food, so I trust you.
Sorry, I didn't mean
to.
No, I would hazard a hypothesis that if the majority of producers are already using the traffic, or which I forget the details, but whichever part of the system is quasi-voluntary, if the majority are already using it, then by using it, you reveal something about yourself along the lines of what you were just saying. But you don't really, whatever, make it as small as possible, but communicate, we are on board, we care about our customers' health, blah, 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 So that's what, I mean, I suppose, my question is just about, in a way, it's a big theoretical question about relevance theory. To what extent do we really pay attention to producers as much as audiences?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think relevance theory makes no bones about being hero-oriented. In the way it presents things, but then that has an impact on the speakers, obviously, as well, who are allowing for what they think the heroes are going to do. But yeah, I mean, and I think what really, I'm going to sidestep the deep theoretical issues and go back to food labeling. And I wonder if the food manufacturers have kind of twigged that it makes no difference on things like chocolate and cakes. They can count, if they make it look delicious enough, it's not going to detract from their sales, but it does add this halo effect of look how honest we are. Look, we're very upfront about this, and we're helping you. It's like the alcohol advertising, isn't it, that says please drink responsibly. It's like they have to do it, and they can get a certain amount of brand. I don't know, halo effect. I keep saying that from it, but they don't actually want it. They don't think it's really going to make much difference. Billy's hand, is that a new hand?
It is. It's a brand new hand. I just bought it. I was just thinking about connections with the law, and I was thinking of Alan Durant's work on contested meanings and things, and I'm wondering in some ways, some of the legal things are applied pragmatics, aren't they? So he talks about things like saying in participating restaurants only at the end of an advert for a special offer, which could mean that it doesn't exist anywhere. And whether that's allowed or not is considered by, the legal folk to decide whether you're allowed to do that, and how things change over time. And I'm assuming you'll be working with participants, but I'm wondering if you might look historically. So the thing that leaps to my mind is the terms and conditions statements, which in audio on radio ads are now read at 200 miles an hour. But that wouldn't have been allowed in the early days when they were new, because you had to do them slow enough for people to take them in. And I'm just wondering if you're thinking of those kinds of comparisons.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. I mean, that made me think of whenever I'm in a clothes shop and you see a rack of clothes and it says up to 20% off. And I always think, well, that could mean no % off, couldn't it? Like I always think that, yeah.
If you bought a COVID test recently, they all say from £2 and then they charge you £80.
Yeah, okay. It's accurate, isn't it? But it's where does it mislead you? What was the other?
I was thinking if you're going to look over time at how things have changed and working with people just to see.
Yeah, I mean that would be a very useful way to do that. I mean, particularly as I think advertisers and marketers have become more and more clever, and every time that one of their tricks is exposed, they have to find another trick, as it were. I mean, I haven't really thought much yet, but this is a very rudimentary.
Well, the other thing to compare. Sorry, somebody else. I was just saying the other thing to compare is when people are not trying to be cynical cheats, like when they're actually trying to just say something like, "The COVID signs on my campus are confusing everybody," but they're trying to be clear.
Yeah, and I mean, and I don't think anybody from my institution will watch this far through the video of this, but I mean, the signage at my university was horrendous when COVID first hit, because there was so much of it. It wasn't just hands, face, space. It was hands, face, space. Check into your venue, do this. And I took a photo of it because it was and they'd very much gone down that throw as much information. If they'd only thought about the cognitive effects, as it were, I want to give all this information. They hadn't thought about the processing effort and what they actually want people to do as a result of this messaging, and what's the quickest, easiest cognitively way to get them to that decision making process. I think that's what I'm kind of most interested in. And once I started delving into the food labeling, I realized there were a lot of complications in that, along the lines of what do food companies really want, what do legislators want. There's voluntary information that still has regulations, there's the mandatory information, there's people who care about their health, there's people who don't care about, so maybe it was a bit of a can of worms, but yeah, I think what I want to maybe do is think about how designers can kind of map that cognitive journey from what's the message we're giving and what's the conclusion we want them to reach, or the action we want them to take, or the assumption we want strengthened or eliminated or created.
If I can squeeze in another example, I'm going to send you some pictures, but the thing that's been happening on our campus is the phrase "in use" has been used. And if you see it on a urinal, it says urinal in use, it means use this one. And if you see it on a window, it says in use, it means don't close the window. And you can imagine the confusion.
Yeah.
I'll send you some pictures.
Urinal in use by an invisible man.
It means don't use the one that doesn't say that on it.
Wow, okay, yeah, that's kind of confusing. And you can see how someone just hurriedly made that decision and didn't think through the messaging.
I'll send you some pictures of urinals, something for you to look forward to.
They'll be going into my MA workshop in a few weeks. Stephen, sorry,
Yeah, I think another thing, as I was looking through some of your examples, so the facts up front label, often just white and it had a blue background, but then you take something like the cupcake example where it does have a stoplight that is rather large on the package, but the other package labeling is very simple and very easy to process as, oh, this is an elegant product, just from the feel and colors and choices. So I'm wondering if part of a good analysis of this would take into account the competing cognitive effects and the processing effort for the food label versus the rest of the label. So if the rest of the label is hard to process, then you'll probably focus on the stoplight. Whereas if the rest of the label is more simple and quickly comes to a conclusion as, oh, this is a fancy thing. Oh, whatever, it might be healthy, might not be. And I think having that comparison might be helpful. I know in the classroom, I used to work as an interpreter. And so sometimes the student would look at me as a sign language interpreter, or they would look at the board. Well, I was always competing for cognitive effects. Was I being more effective than the visual information on the board, or was the board giving more cognitive effects and I was too hard to process? And so that back and forth, I think, might have a big factor on how these types of labels are processed.
Yeah, and yeah. So if we pay attention to the thing we think is most relevant, if we can hide those food producers who want to get the brownie points from including that information on the front of their pack, but maybe don't want people to notice it, can have bright, colourful, other stimulating packaging elsewhere. Yeah, that does absolutely make sense, and it's probably the case on the cereal packet with the warnings. There's a lot going on that packet, you know. I mean, I think it's a global brand, you know. You've got the tiger and the cartoon and everything, and the warnings are there because they have to be, but they're quite hard to see. I think they're not going to jump out of you as you're kind of browsing the shelves, right? And I think it is that decision-making process where you pick up the product probably with the assumption that you're going to buy it to a certain degree, and does it strengthen that assumption that you're going to buy it, or does it eliminate it and stop you buying it? And yeah, if you can distract people with cartoon tiger, then probably not going to see that. Yeah, that was a really interesting point. And yeah, might be of use to people who are working for the food companies rather than for the policymakers. Thank you.
And there's one question, one comment on the chat we haven't mentioned. It's from DC.
DC, could you reveal your identity? We don't know who you are. I know you've got no microphone, but it would be great to know your name, at least your first name. Aha.
Thank you.
Thank you. Manufacturers often compete against their own products, selling some of their products to the health conscious and others who get confused. Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be part of a bigger strategy overall. I would imagine. Yeah. Anyway. Christoph, is that a hand up?
Yes, it is. Initially, I was exploring the reactions, the type of reactions as providing relevant information or not. So anyway, so I have a clarification question. So in many of your examples, you show how people will focus on information that is relevant to them and how it is good to provide relevant information. I think that we can say that without relevance theory. So one of the added value of relevance theory would be to show that the presumption of relevance play a role in interpretation. I think that I got one example from your talk, which was, oh, it's red, the color red is being interpreted in that context as a warning signal. Would you have some other examples where, by means of the presumption of relevance, people come to interpret the visual aspect of your signals?
I mean, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I guess the Chilean examples with the fact that it's presented as a warning. But I mean, what kind of strikes me about this, and it's something I haven't really thought through yet, is with things like labeling, the presumption of optimal relevance is triggered by extensive information, and therefore you've got to see yourself as as being addressed by it. So I think there's issues to explore there around kind of information that doesn't. Who is the addressee of the product labeling? Who is assuming optimal relevance? Which I think is the issue with written communication more broadly, and broadcast communication as well. Sperber and Wilson say it's whoever believes they are part of whoever thinks it is likely to be relevant. I can't remember the wording.
Well, it's mainly consumers. No, it's consumers, and I think that these
but I think
are.
I wonder if some people might pick up the product and think, oh well, they're not talking to me. Like if it's something that's high in fat and someone picks it up and they think, well, they're not telling me that because I'm not fat or I don't have a heart problem, so the salt information isn't relevant to me. I'm not the target audience for that, and kind of so process it from a different perspective. Much as if we eavesdrop another conversation, we can interpret it, but we might not interpret it from our own perspective as being optimally relevant. I don't know. That's something to think.
Actually, the information that it is about health, that these boxes are about health, is never explicitly given. So I guess it's retrieved by a presumption of relevance.
Yeah, and I must say, when I was preparing this presentation, I found it odd that I kept saying nutrients, which is because for me that has an association of being good. You're nourished by nutrients, but of course nutrients, most of the things on the labeling that are mandated by a government policy are negative things. It doesn't tell you how much vitamin C might be in it. It only tells you that the negative things. So there is I guess there's something there about it. There's a presumption that it's relevant to tell me about things that are bad for me, more relevant than it is to tell me about things that might be good for me. As I say, these are very early thoughts. I need to do a lot more thinking around this, and I'm not even sure if it's something. I'm still kind of like, is this worth putting my energy into? Am I going to get out of it? And I absolutely agree that a lot of these things can be said without needing to talk about relevance theory. And I'm not necessarily, I think I've decided I'm not going to give my MA students a full-on relevance theory session. I'm just going to talk in more general terms, but still talking about assumptions and conclusions and premises and things. But I don't think they necessarily need to know. You don't necessarily have to buy into the whole program to see this, I think.
Okay, thanks. So we have gone over time actually. I kind of slipped out of my original role of being strict timekeeper, so I do apologize. But it was a very good, interesting discussion. I think this was the kind of spirit of this platform where we can bring in new ideas and discuss something we haven't tried before. And I think it is very, I don't know, it might be just me not reading enough, but I don't think I've read much about relevance and design. So
this was something I was going to say actually. If anyone knows of any work in this area, if anyone knows it, because I haven't come across it being applied in this area, but perhaps it has and I've missed it.
But so it's very good to see sort of a new area of relevance application is like being identified by you for now. So thank you, Kate, for very interesting talk, and thank you everyone for very engaging discussion. So as I was saying earlier, we are still we will be inviting speakers for January, February, and March. We will send out emails soon, but if you have ideas, please let us know. The next time, next one will be end of November. I can't remember when, but last Wednesday of each month, and that will be the next one. Next one we have Pauline Madela. Currently, now she's where does she work?
Bedfordshire now, I think.
Bedfordshire. So she's a brand new full-time permanent lecturer in linguistics in Bedfordshire, and recently graduated from Brighton. She will talk about a work from her PhD that's the last Wednesday of November at 5:30. By that time, I think we will be out of summertime. So we will be an hour ahead. But anyway, thank you very much for everyone for coming. And thank you, Kate, again, for a very interesting talk. See you in November.
Thank you.